All right, problem 12-89. One of the identities in problem 12-86 from the previous day, you initially worked with in chapter 7. It was cosine squared plus sine squared equals 1, and there's the x's in there. And this is called the Pythagorean identity, and we said it had to do with the Pythagorean theorem, right? So work with your team to explore the following question. Why is it worth 1? Why is that called the Pythagorean identity? Does it have anything to do with the Pythagorean theorem? We've kind of talked about this before, but on a triangle, we said horizontal is worth cosine of x, and our height is worth sine of x, and always on our unit circle, the hypotenuse is worth 1. So if we do the Pythagorean theorem with these values instead of a squared, or a, b, and c, we're going to get this identity. So we'd have cosine squared. That means you're taking the whole thing and squaring it. That's why the little 2 is there. You could also write it as cosine of x with a big parenthesis and squared, but that's a little bit more writing that you have to do. So that's why we just put the 2 after the COS part. So that's this side squared plus sine squared and equals 1 squared, which is just a 1. So that's why we're getting this Pythagorean identity that works. It is from the Pythagorean theorem. That is correct. All right, so 2 more very useful identities can come from the Pythagorean identity. So discover the first related identity. Divide both sides of the equation by cosine squared. So let's just do that part. Don't keep going. So the regular the Pythagorean identity, we'll write that down. And it said divide everything, basically divide all the sides by cosine squared. So I'm going to divide each part by cosine squared. And this is just going to get another identity. Okay, so cosine squared divided by cosine squared is just a 1. Sine squared over cosine squared, well, sine over cosine is tangent, so this is just going to be tangent squared of x. And then 1 over cosine, or that's the reciprocal function, that is actually going to be called secant, and then it'll be squared too. Okay, so that's another identity that I want us to write on our toolkit right now, because again, we're going to be referencing that, so I'm just going to write it over here in one of my blanks. So 1 plus tangent squared equals secant squared. Okay, so make sure you write that one down. We're going to use that one for later. And then it also says to find a second related identity, divide both sides by sine squared. So we'll do that very same thing, starting with the original one. And now we're going to divide everything by sine squared. Oops. So kind of very similar things are happening. Cosine squared over sine squared is going to be, it's almost like it's tangent squared, but it's upside down. So if you remember, the reciprocal of tangent is called cotangent. So that's going to just be cotangent squared. Okay. Sine squared over sine squared is a 1. And then 1 over sine squared, the reciprocal of, or the equivalent of 1 over sine is that reciprocal function of cosecant, and it'll also be squared because these things were both squared. Okay, so that's why those are remaining squared. So here's a second identity, I guess a third identity total using that Pythagorean identity. So I'm going to write that one down, and that's actually going to be it. There's an extra space on here. So cotangent squared of x plus 1 equals cosecant squared of x. Okay, so that'll just be nothing really. All right, so make sure you write those down because you're going to be able to use this, or you're going to need to use this trig identity toolkit because I'm not going to expect you to memorize all these things.